The Texas sun beat down mercilessly on Jake Thompson's weathered face as he dismounted his horse near the banks of the Rio Grande. At 62, his joints protested every movement, but his resolve remained as solid as the oak tree that had become his landmark. The year was 1885, and rumors about the Cattleman's Bank potentially closing had been circulating through Laredo for weeks. "Easy there, Dusty," Jake whispered to his chestnut mare, patting her neck gently. The horse had been his companion for over a decade, carrying him across countless miles of Texas rangeland. Today's journey felt different, heavier somehow, laden with the weight of 4 decades of hard-earned savings. Jake pulled a worn leather satchel from his saddlebags, feeling the familiar weight of $3,247 in gold coins and bills, every penny he'd saved from his work as a ranch hand, cattle driver, and occasional bounty hunter. His calloused hands trembled slightly as he opened the bag, not from fear, but from the magnitude of what he was about to do. 40 years of sweat and blood, he muttered, looking at the money that represented missed meals, worn-out boots, and countless nights sleeping under the stars. Instead of paying for a hotel room, the land around him appeared abandoned scrubland, dotted with mesquite and prickly pear, bordered by the lazy curve of the Rio Grande. No cattle grazed here, no homesteads marked the horizon. Jake had been riding through this area for years, and it seemed forgotten by time itself. He'd chosen a spot 20 paces from the distinctive lightning-scarred oak, near a cluster of red rocks that formed a natural marker. The ground was hard-packed clay mixed with sand, perfect for his purposes. Jake began digging with a small spade he'd brought, each shovelful bringing back memories of the life that had led him here. "Remember when we drove them longhorns to Kansas, Dusty?" He spoke to his horse, who stood patiently nearby. "Made $23 that trip. Thought I was rich as a king." The hole deepened slowly. Jake's back ached, but he persevered, driven by a lifetime of stubbornness that had carried him through droughts, stampedes, and the occasional confrontation with cattle rustlers. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, he finally deemed the hole deep enough. Jake wrapped his money in oiled canvas, then placed it carefully in a sturdy wooden box he'd purchased specifically for this purpose. The box went into the hole, followed by several rocks to mark the depth, then the carefully replaced earth. He patted the soil down firmly, scattering dried grass and small rocks over the surface to make it look undisturbed. Standing up slowly, Jake wiped the sweat from his brow and surveyed his work. The burial site looked natural, indistinguishable from the surrounding terrain except for his carefully memorized landmarks. He pulled out a small notebook and sketched a rough map, noting the distance from the oak tree, the position of the red rocks, and the angle of the distant mesa. "There," he said with satisfaction. "Safe from bank failures and thieves alike." As he prepared to leave, Jake noticed something he'd overlooked before: ancient pottery shards scattered near the riverbank, bleached white by years of sun and weather. He picked up a few pieces, examining the intricate patterns carved into the clay. The craftsmanship was unlike anything he'd seen in his travels, speaking of a culture far older than the settlements he knew. "Wonder who made these," he mused, pocketing a small fragment before mounting Dusty for the ride back to town. The setting sun cast long shadows across the landscape as Jake rode away, unaware that he'd just buried his life savings on land that had been sacred to the Apache Mescalero tribe for generations. Land they'd been forced to abandon 30 years earlier during the turbulent years of Western expansion, but land they'd never forgotten and never stopped calling home. 7 years had passed since Jake buried his treasure, and the old cowboy's hair had turned completely white. His small adobe house on the outskirts of Laredo felt increasingly empty as his contemporaries either died or moved away to live with their families. The Cattleman's Bank had indeed failed in 1887, validating his decision to hide his money. though the knowledge brought him little comfort in his growing loneliness. On a sweltering August morning in 1892, Jake was mending harness leather on his front porch when he noticed an unusual amount of activity near the courthouse. Groups of men in suits were gathering, some carrying official-looking documents, others gesturing animatedly toward the horizon. His curiosity piqued. Jake decided to investigate. "Morning, Sheriff Morrison," Jake called to the lawman standing near the courthouse steps. "What's all the commotion about?" Sheriff Morrison, a man Jake had known for over 20 years, looked troubled. "Jake, we've got ourselves a situation. Remember that stretch of land out by the Rio Grande, near the old lightning-struck oak?" Jake's blood ran cold, though he kept his expression neutral. "Sure, I know the area. What about it?" "Well, it turns out that land belongs to the Apache Mescalero tribe. They've got lawyers now, and they're demanding it back. Apparently, they were forced off during the Indian Wars back in the 50s and 60s, but they never formally ceded the territory." "I thought all that business was settled years ago," Jake replied, his mouth suddenly dry. "So did we all," Morrison continued. "But these Apache representatives showed up yesterday with a federal judge and a pile of documents thick as a saddle blanket. They're claiming about 2,000 acres, including that whole bend in the river." Jake watched as a group of Apache men emerged from the courthouse, led by a tall, dignified man with silver-streaked hair and traditional dress mixed with modern attire. The man's presence commanded respect, and even the white officials seemed to regard him with cautious deference. "That's Joseph Crow Feather," Morrison explained quietly. "He's their spokesman. Educated back east, speaks better English than most folks around here. Says his grandfather used to tell stories about the sacred places along that stretch of river." Jake studied Crow Feather's face, noting the weathered features that spoke of a life spent outdoors, not unlike his own. The Apache man's eyes held a depth of determination that Jake recognized, the look of someone fighting for something beyond mere money or convenience. "They planning to settle there?" Jake asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "That's what they're saying." Crow Feather brought 40 people with him, families, children, elders. "They've been living on a reservation up north, but apparently it's been tough. Poor soil, harsh winters. This land here represents a chance for them to return to their ancestral home." Jake felt his stomach tighten. His life savings lay buried on land that these people considered sacred, land they'd been unjustly driven from decades ago. The pottery shards he'd found suddenly took on new meaning. They weren't random artifacts, but remnants of a living culture. That afternoon, Jake rode out to the burial site, ostensibly to check on some strays, but really to see the land through new eyes. As he approached the lightning-scarred oak, he found he wasn't alone. Joseph Crow Feather stood near the river, holding what appeared to be a piece of pottery similar to the shards Jake had found years earlier. "Good afternoon," Jake called out, dismounting Dusty at a respectful distance. Crow Feather turned, his dark eyes assessing Jake with quiet intelligence. "Good afternoon. You must be one of the local ranchers." "Name's Jake Thompson. I've been riding through this area for years. Sheriff Morrison told me about your situation." "Our situation, Crow?" Feather repeated with a slight smile that held no humor. "Yes, I suppose that's one way to put it. My people called this place water where the spirits dance. The pottery you see here," he held up the fragment, "was made by my great-grandmother. She lived here before the soldiers came." Jake felt the weight of his secret pressing down on him like a mountain. Must be hard, coming back after so many years. Hard, yes, but necessary. Crow Feather's voice carried the weight of generations. "The reservation land is dying. Our children need to know their true home, to understand where they come from. This isn't about revenge, Mr. Thompson. It's about survival, cultural survival." As the two men stood in the fading light, Jake realized his simple plan to secure his future had become infinitely more complicated. 3 weeks after his encounter with Joseph Crow Feather, Jake found himself unable to sleep. Every night, he lay in his small bed staring at the ceiling, wrestling with a moral dilemma that seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. The Apache families had already begun setting up a temporary camp near the river, and Jake could see smoke from their fires when he climbed the hill behind his house. The legal proceedings were moving forward rapidly. Federal authorities had confirmed the tribe's claim to the land, and the local government was being forced to acknowledge the legitimacy of their ancestral rights. What troubled Jake most wasn't the threat to his hidden treasure, but the growing respect he felt for these people, who had endured so much injustice. On a cool September morning, Jake decided he couldn't carry the burden alone any longer. He rode to the Apache camp, where he found Crow Feather teaching the group of children how to identify edible plants along the riverbank. "Mr. Thompson," Crow Feather greeted him warmly. "What brings you to our temporary home? I need to speak with you privately," Jake said, his voice heavy with emotion. "It's important." They walked away from the camp, stopping near the familiar lightning-scarred oak. Jake dismounted and stood for a long moment, gathering his courage. "7 years ago," Jake began slowly, "I buried something here. My life's savings, every penny I'd earned in 40 years of cowboy work." Crow Feather's expression remained neutral, but Jake could see the understanding dawning in his eyes. "I thought this land was abandoned," Jake continued. "I had no idea it belonged to anyone, let alone that it was sacred to your people. I found pottery shards, but I didn't understand what they meant." "And now you do," Crow Feather said quietly. Jake nodded. "Now I do, and I'm ashamed. Not just of trespassing, but of not understanding that land belongs to someone, even when it looks empty to ignorant eyes like mine." They stood in silence for several minutes, watching the Rio Grande flow lazily past. Finally, Crow Feather spoke. "My grandfather used to say that the earth holds many secrets, but she reveals them only when the time is right. Perhaps your money was meant to be here for this moment." "I don't understand," Jake replied. Crow Feather smiled, the first genuine smile Jake had seen from him. "Our people need resources to rebuild here. Seeds for planting, tools for construction, materials for proper shelter before winter comes. We have legal right to the land, but legal rights don't put food on the table or roofs over children's heads." Jake felt a strange mix of relief and apprehension. "You're suggesting—" "I'm suggesting nothing," Crow Feather said firmly. "The choice is yours, Jake Thompson. You could dig up your money in the darkness of night and disappear. You could hire lawyers to fight our claim. You could do many things. But I think you're not that kind of man." That evening, Jake returned to the site with a shovel and a heavy heart. As he dug, he thought about the life that money represented, the missed comforts, the years of solitude, the careful planning for a future that now seemed uncertain. But he also thought about the Apache children he'd seen playing by the river, their laughter mixing with the sound of flowing water. When he finally unearthed the wooden box, Jake sat beside the hole for a long time, holding his life's work in his hands. The money was still there, still safe, but its meaning had transformed completely. The next morning, Jake found Crow Feather preparing for a community meeting. Without a word, he handed over the wooden box. "This should help your people get started," Jake said simply. Crow Feather opened the box, his eyes widening at the substantial sum inside. "Jake Thompson, this is your life's work." "No," Jake replied, feeling lighter than he had in years. "My life's work was learning how to be a better man. This is just money." 6 months later, Jake found himself living in a small cabin on the edge of the Apache settlement, working as a liaison between the tribe and the local ranching community. His cowboy skills proved invaluable in helping establish the new community, and his knowledge of the local terrain made him a trusted advisor. As he sat on his porch one evening, watching Crow Feather's grandchildren play near the river, Jake reflected on the strange turns life could take. He'd buried his treasure seeking security, only to find that true security came from understanding his place in something larger than himself. The lightning-scarred oak still stood as a landmark, but now it marked not a secret burial site, but the heart of a thriving community where two cultures had learned to respect each other's dreams.